Again, I just want to point out that we should understand that with Shankaracharya, the problem is not the relationship between God and the world. It's the relationship really between Saguna Brahman and having as Saguna Brahman with his energies attached and this Nirguna Brahman. And as we see in his system, there isn't any relationship. In order to have the two things together, in reality, you have to postulate ignorance, which has no standing whatsoever. When you say it can't be described as exists or not exists, really that means it has no standing. It can't be the ignorance of Brahman. Whose ignorance is it? Where did it come from? How did Brahman get covered by ignorance? None of these questions can be answered by them. All they can say is, it's just there. You know? We have sometimes a similar question arises, how did the jiva fall down? It also seems a little difficult to understand, but at least in principle it can be explained that the jiva is little and he can become covered by ignorance, and that doesn't affect Krishna. How exactly that took place, what level of Vaikuntha he fell for, where he fell from slow degrees, where he fell from a low position, did he fall out of the Brahma Jyoti, all that kind of stuff, there's a whole range of different things to be said. But, and I usually don't say much about it because Prabhupada didn't, but here they have to answer the question that Brahman himself becomes covered by ignorance and thinks of himself as a jiva, slouching around, 142nd Street and Broadway or whatever. How did this happen? They can't explain. So this ignorance is required. Otherwise, you don't have teachers. You don't have a system. You don't have an existence of a world. But it actually has no place whatsoever in the ontology. So really, they just really want to do away with the material world and with activities. A total radical reaction, devaluation of the material world, which is impious as far as we're concerned. It's Krishna's world. What I wanted to do to finish up our discussion today, I'm not talking about this discussion in Chaitanya Charitamrita about what is the actual Mahavakya, the main mantra. That's a technical discussion, really. According to Sanskrit Vedanta hermeneutics, for something to be a Mahavakya, or a main prime utterance in the light of which you understand all other utterances, there are certain characteristics it has to meet. So Chaitanya Mahaprabhu argues that Tattvamasi is not the Mahavakya, but that Omkara is. But that's their slogan, huh? You should know this. Ask me.
Is this from Vedanta?
This is from the Chandogya Upanishad.
It's not to be found in Vedanta. It's not at all to be found in Vedanta.
It is. It's in the Upanishads. It's not in the Vedanta Sutra.
Right. It's not taken back in the Vedanta Sutra.
No, it's not. It's in the Upanishads, in the Vedanta Sutra. Tattvam asmi. ASMI. Asi, it's Asi, right? Yeah, are. That you are, huh? So for the Mayavadis, by the way, Madhvacharya, in his analysis of the passages, this occurs in the context of a longer sentence, and grammatically you can read this as Atatvam Asi. That you are not. You are not that. You are not Brahman. You are not. And actually you can do it. That's what Madhva does. But generally this is taken as their liberating utterance for the Mayavadis. There's some others also. That you understand this, in other words, the identity. To them this means you are God. Right? That's what it means. You are God. I realize my oneness with Brahman, my cessation of my existence as a phenomenal being, the disappearance of all ignorance and desire, the disappearance of all activity, work, the vanishing of senses, sense objects, possessor of senses, everything goes, and you just merge. All consequent upon this liberating utterance, Tattvam Asi. Now, after treating of these matters and straightening everybody out on the issue of Parinamavada and Vivartavada, they ask, and his giving the doctrine is you need to have the direct understanding. And first he criticizes Shankaracharya. That's the first thing that goes on, right? So he sums up his criticism by saying, look at text 131. In all Vedic sutras and literatures, it is Lord Krishna who is to be understood. But the followers of Shankaracharya have covered the real meaning of the Vedas with indirect explanations. So he goes back to that theme. The self-evident Vedic literatures, Swata Pramana, self-evident. Text 132. The self-evident Vedic literatures are the highest evidence of all. But if these literatures are interpreted, Lakshana, he uses that word, Lakshana, they receive interpretation, their self-evident nature is lost. Prabhupada says that is a case of principis obsta. I've not been able to find that anywhere. Looked up different books of logical fallacies and everywhere, and it's so out of current usage that I haven't yet found it. In the purport to chapter 132, and to text 132, he says that, Yeah. I don't know Latin anymore, and usually I have some books that tell you all different logical fallacies. They have different Latin names, prost hoc, propter hoc, and things like that. But this one I couldn't find. Anyway, so he says the Mayavada school, giving up the real, easily understood meaning of Vedic literature, has introduced indirect meanings based on their imaginative power to prove their philosophy. So that's his case. So he's taken apart Shankaracharya. That's the destructive work. So then they say this when he shows, it says here, for each and every sutra. So he took them through and showed them to some extent. So they say, we have no quarrel with your refutations. We say that it comes from world jugglery. Now let us see, they say in 137, how well you can describe the sutras in terms of their direct meaning. Hearing this, Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu began his direct explanation of Vedanta Sutra. Now if we read this direct explanation, which is only a couple of verses really, it just starts off by finding that Brahman is the greatest. He has energies. He's the Supreme Personality of Godhead, who's the goal. You can't deny his spiritual potencies. He can only be approached by devotional service. And then he discusses Abhideya, Sambandha, Abhideya, and Prayojana. That first was Sambandha, Abhideya, Prayojana. And that's all. And so after he finishes this discussion, it says here, which is very short, you see it only goes from, in here, summarized from 138 to about 147, about 10 146. When all the Mayavadi sannyasis heard this, they immediately accepted it. It was true. It was self-evident. It was self-evident. So I spent some time trying to think about this self-evident, what it means. And generally, if you look at a mathematical system, say like a system of geometry or even a constructive metaphysical system, there's two criterions it has to meet. There's soundness and completeness. Soundness means free from internal contradiction. And completeness means has application over all the instances that you're discussing. And when you look at a system of metaphysics, say, that looks pretty plausible, you look for these two things. Is it sound? That is to say, are there internal contradictions or gaps in the thing? And is it complete? Does it cover every instance that might come up? Somebody has a metaphysical system that somehow or other neglects to account for the fact of motion, say. Then you'd say it's not complete. This is what Aristotle criticized Plato for. He never accounts for motion, you know. So it's not complete. So it's got to pretty much cover everything, and it has to be free from internal contradiction. So when it's really coherent like that and doesn't leave anything out, then it has this quality of self-evidence. So here the range of topics is the verses, the sutras, of the Vedanta. So completeness means it has to account for all the sutras. And soundness means that it can account for them in the most natural, unstrained, uncontradictory, straightforward way. So somehow or other, that's what Chaitanya Mahaprabhu did. And I think that we can get an example of this if we simply look at the first two sutras. Remember I gave them to you on the sheet of paper? Because if you look at what Shankaracharya does with these first two sutras and how they cohere together, and what Chaitanya Mahaprabhu understanding does, then you can see right away what the strain is upon the sutras that Shankaracharya's interpretation puts. This is very nice to do because almost everybody in India at least knows Tato Brahma Jignasa and Janmadasya Yataha. And it's practically all we know of Vedanta Sutra too. But just with these two verses, the point comes out very clearly. So it begins, which was described as the solemn declaration of purpose, Atato Brahma Jignasa, and now therefore let us inquire into Brahman. Now everyone, all schools will say, why should there be an inquiry into Brahman? Because by inquiring into Brahman, you attain the highest goal of life. This is the aim of human form of life. You achieve freedom from repetition of birth and death. All other goals or all other ends in the Vedas are subsumed under this one, that this is the highest goal and the highest happiness. Therefore, you should inquire into Brahman because it brings release from birth and death into the material world. This is what everyone says about this. Right? By understanding Brahman, you become free from birth and death. You're liberated. Everybody says that, right? Okay, so the next verse very obviously defines Brahman. Janmadasya Yataha. Now, what's wrong on Shankara's interpretation? What is Janmadasya Yataha? What does that define? Which Brahman does it define? Yeah, the lower Brahman. If you understand that Brahman, do you get freedom from repetition of birth and death? No way. You don't. So right here at the very outset of Vedanta Sutra, which tells us we should inquire into Brahman and to understand what Brahman is, so we can achieve freedom from repetition of birth and death, that Brahman is now defined as the lower Brahman, the Brahman who is an object not of knowledge which frees us, but of nescience which binds us. So clearly Vyasadeva must have be something wrong, right, with him. He put the wrong definition in the second sutra. But we accept that Vyasadeva is this is the Supreme Personality of Godhead. This is Ishvara Vachana that is free from defects or errors, right? So that this right here you can see how if we accept that Brahman is this is the highest Brahman, the Brahman who has energies, Janmadasyataha means that he actually has energies. But then these two sutras cohere together very nicely. But on Shankaras, they don't cohere. That on Lord Chaitanya's straightforward, direct understanding, you just accept the meaning of this is Brahman. What Shankara is really saying is this is not Brahman. After all, do you remember how Sadananda Yogendra defines Brahman? As Satchidananda, one without a second, pure knowledge, pure consciousness, pure bliss. You don't find in the Mayavadi literature, anytime they define Brahman, they don't use this definition. This is not what they think of as Brahman as. They think of Brahman as this, Advaya, one without a second, having no second, being of the nature of pure consciousness, bliss, so on, devoid of all qualities. That's how they define. Right? So, Shankaracharya's interpretation, they don't cohere, they don't fit together. It's incoherent, contradictory right away. Big mistake right here in the first sutras by Vyasadeva. Somehow or other, he defined that Brahman which gives liberation from birth and death as what Shankaracharya considers to be Brahman is an object of nescience, which never gives liberation.
So in Shankaracharya's explanation, how does he explain that? He says Vyasadeva is mistaken.
No. Nothing is. He just goes on and gives a purport by which he just explains. I don't have it with me. I have it back in the room. He just, because what this has done, what he does is these verses are explaining that the cause of the world is not the unintelligent pradhan, as the Sankhya philosophy says. According to Sankhya philosophy, that is to say the atheistic Sankhya school, the cause of matter is pradhan, the cause of the world. There's Sankhya, there's two things according to the atheistic Sankhya. There's Prakriti, which is matter, which is going through its changes and everything like that. And then there's Purusha, which are the individual souls. And the souls are somehow entangled in Prakriti and they have to become released. And when they're released, their Prakriti ceases to act on them. And the ultimate state of things is a plurality of liberated, windowless monads. I mean, souls that have no contact with other souls or with nature. That's the atheistic Sankhya picture. So in that Sankhya philosophy, the material nature is not caused by an intelligent agent. So he said to refute that, the Vedanta Sutra says that no, Brahman is the cause. Well, all this discourse is taking place in the lower realm of avidya. You see. So the correct avidya is Brahman is the cause, whereas the incorrect ignorance, see this, you're into a correct ignorance and an incorrect ignorance. Huh? The correct ignorance is that Brahman is the cause. The incorrect ignorance is that pradhan, unintelligent pradhan, is the cause. So that's how he deals with these verses. But then later on he says, no, there's a higher Brahman. In that handout I gave you, he says that. Okay, he says, now it's been established that the cause of the world is Brahman, so why don't the sutras stop here? Why do they go on? Well, they go on because actually there's a higher and a lower Brahman. And then he goes on to his thing. Yeah.
So Vedanta Sutra, later on there'll be other descriptions of Brahman, but he'll just interpret those in different situations, those Brahmans as Nirguna Brahman.
Yeah. I don't know. I don't know exactly, how you understand the sutras, which text they refer to, what do they say, Obviously the thing to do someday is to sit down with all the sutras, everybody's commentary, and see what they make of each and try to understand what's going on. I haven't had the time to do that. Very few people do in their lives. To actually understand, to become a Vedantist. All I could understand is he manages, whenever it comes up, that from the sutras or from the text of the Upanishads, it speaks of Brahman as having energies, as having relationships, qualities. He says this is Saguna, and wherever it speaks of it as being one without a second, as having no qualities, and so this is Nirguna. And in this way, he can just, deal with the differences.
You say that the Saguna Brahman is an object of omniscience. What does that actually mean?
That when you look at Brahman, when you try to understand the highest principle, and you're in a state of ignorance, then you see that Brahman as having qualities. In a state of ignorance, you see this world, all the things around, and you see this world is also is the property or the adjunct of a cause, who is Ishvara, the controller, and so on. When knowledge arises, then you can understand all this plurality vanishes. It's all a product of ignorance. The distinction between yourself and that highest Brahman is that Saguna Brahman is not there, and it's all one. So there's two truths there. There's the avidya is actually classified as a relative truth. We'll see the Buddhist philosophers also have this doctrine of two truths. They have it too. There's another place that the world doesn't exist or has no reality. So they have to do away with it. Yeah.
Why from the part of Srila Prabhupada and Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu where there are so many warnings to not read Sarira Kabasya and Advaita texts, since it seems that once we get the understanding of what's wrong, eventually it can be read to show what are the mistakes.
I asked Prabhupada about those warnings. I said, if I'm going to deal with these things and have to argue with them, then I have to read them. And he said, yes, you can do that. He said, just be careful. But it's a fact that people do become very bewildered by this. There have been a number of people that we thought were devotees anyway that became Mayavadis. Or maybe they already were. And so one should be careful. After all, you're reading this, I'm standing here, telling you what's wrong with it at every minute. Maybe if I weren't doing that, somebody might think, well, maybe there's something to this. Yeah, Arjun?
We see all over so many places in Prabhupada's books. He quotes Narayana Prabhupada.
Mm-hmm.
So it would seem that probably the followers of Sankaracharya wouldn't appreciate the way Prabhupada quotes it, probably.
Yeah.
They don't think of it the same way Prabhupada would think this language.
Yeah, I don't know. I tried it on one guy once. He said, that doesn't mean that. It means something else, So, I'm sure they have some other indication.
I always say that. One time I ordered that Bhajagovinda, and they had some very, very tricky explanation.
Yeah, well, the one I heard was that he says that about all the gods. That's what they said to me. He says that about all the gods.
It's the name of his guru.
Huh? Or his name of his guru. Yeah, that's another one. That's right.
Right.
Huh? Govinda.
Yeah.
Anyway, I've heard different things. They don't want to accept it. But he is actually Shankaracharya. As you see, the Maya picture that he doesn't accept, the Saguna Brahman, is actually a materialistic idea of God. It's a common idea that most people have. God is an old man, or something like that, or that God is the universal form. Diverse in many, one without a second, in the universal form. Yeah.
That's the reason it's difficult. Because it plays on one's false ego. One starts thinking that one has superior knowledge and that people are worshipping form or Lord.
Yeah, well, when I discovered that God wasn't a person, I immediately felt superior to all these people going to church. I mean, sometime in my late adolescence, I figured out the difference between, infinite time and eternity. And then I had to realize that, wasn't in person. Ultimate truth couldn't be expressed by words. And then I felt sorry for all these people going to church, and so I was a Mayavadi. And thousands of people have this realization. All of them think they're better than everybody else when they get it. Hundreds of thousands of people. I mean, it happens all the time. Usually if you're one of these people that think about this kind of stuff, between the ages of 15 and 20, you figure out impersonal philosophy, right? Especially if there's somebody going around, giving you some dope or teaching you from the Tao Te King or something, Yeah.
One time, this philosopher came with his followers to Chaitanya College. Me and Pushkar were in the audience. And they were talking about Saguna Brahman, Nirguna Brahman. And it was a little intolerant for us to hear, so we objected. And the man, I remember, he sort of made a sort of smile, a sort of patient sort of smile. And then he began explaining how, what he was saying. But it was like, he's just like being patient with us.
Yeah, that's right. The emotional bhaktas, right, who don't know anything, and they'll just come to a higher understanding, I know.
Because we react, when they get a little offensive, we get all upset about it. And I'll just see lower level.
That's right, yeah.
What did the Mayavadis explain as the source of Saguna Brahman? They don't have an explanation.
Source of Saguna Brahman? It comes from ignorance.
What's that?
That we don't know. That you can't ask about.
Oh, I see.
That, it's just, all you can say is it's there, Or maybe it's not there. Depends on whether you're enlightened or not. I mean, actually, if you're not enlightened, you think there's ignorance. Really, Shankaracharya is not so much in the theory of an illusion. It's not about illusion, but about the illusion of illusion. Because there is no illusion, right? So if you think there's an illusion, that's the illusion.
Madhacharya used to say something like, is Maya real or unreal? It's a question he's asked.
Well, I don't know. That's a question you can ask. And their answer is, this can't be said to be either one or the other.
Right, because other than the trapped, if they say it's real.
If they say it's real, they're screwed, and if they say it's unreal, they're screwed. So they say it's neither. Will that be allowed? It will not. We won't allow. They have to declare themselves. Usually, things either are there or they're not there. I don't know of any in-between state. They may be there temporarily, but that doesn't mean they're not there at all.
I'm a little dull to this. How do you trap them by this question?
Ask, does Maya exist, or or ignorance, does it exist, or does it not exist?
And if I'm a Mayavadi and I say it doesn't exist, what?
Then this world is real. What's the problem? It's not ignorance. Everything's here. Krishna's God, there's no ignorance, right? What do we have to get free from? What's all this talk? And they say, yeah, it does exist. And then you say, well, whose ignorance is it? What is the ashraya? Jiva Goswami puts it. What is the ashraya of this ignorance? The shelter. Whose ignorance is it? Is it the jivas? No, the jivas are a product of ignorance. Has to be Brahman's. How does Brahman fall into ignorance? If he's, Jnana Swarup, his essential nature is knowledge. That's it, they can't answer it.
So does Does Maya exist? Or
All they say is, you'll understand when you become enlightened.
Do they say you can, like our theory of, our idea of Jiva Mukta, can you get enlightened in this lifetime, in this body?
Who?
They
Me?
say they can,
Yeah, I guess so. Oh, I guess so. Sure. Of course, you don't really see any Mayavadis, actually. And what they do is they do this weird thing, you know. They identify everything with God, and then they proceed to enjoy it and think of it as divine Leela. Anyway, we'll get into their actual practices a little later on.
Briefly, how do you pin it down when they say that Maya does exist?
Maya does exist. Then you say, whose Maya is it? Who is illusioned? If they say you're illusioned, then you have to say, oh, I thought I existed because of the illusion. Right? They say, well, whose ignorance is it? You're ignorant. And what's the result of this ignorance? Well, the first result is I think of myself as an individual being. I owe my existence to ignorance. So I cannot be I'm the product of ignorance, right? So I can't be the one who's ignorant. I'm produced by ignorance. I can't be the one who has the ignorance. So whose ignorance is it? There's only one thing left. It's Brahman. That's all that exists anyway, right? Aside from this ghostly, ignorance, kind of like a ghost, it's sort of there and it's not there. It sort of haunts the system, You hear it rattling its chain in the attics, but when you go up to find it, it's not there.
if Maya doesn't exist, then they can say there's only Brahman.
Huh?
If Maya doesn't exist.
Yeah, if there is no Maya, then everything is Brahman, and it's all one, and that's the state of knowledge. But then what are you talking about? Why are you coming to say we need to be liberated? There's no problem, right? It's all one. We all can see that. You're not there, I'm not there, we're not having this discussion. Now the far out thing is how many people are convinced about this position. That's the really far out thing. Yeah.
To go back to Ramanuja's explanation of the Chandogya Upanishad verse, because it seems to me that he supports the fact that the only truth in the clay object is clay. And I don't see
that's not how I understand it. Okay. Arambanam means that which is taken or touched. Vajrarambanam. It's grasped on account of speech, we take to mean on account of activity by speech. For activities such as the fetching water in the pitcher are preceded by speech, fetch water. For the bringing about of such an activity, the material clay enters into contact with a vikara, transformation, and gets a special name. That's the name of that special transformation, which is applied to the effect. To the end that certain activities be accomplished, the substance clay receives a new configuration and a name. Hence, jars and other things of clay are clay, that is, they are of the substance. As far as their substance goes, it's clay and nothing else. This is only true, that is to say, known through authoritative means of proof, only because the effects are not known as different substances. So when it says, as clay they are true, it means that you know that they are made of clay because you're only dealing with the substances, because you're dealing with what they're made out of, the substantial cause, the material cause. If you know clay, you know the substantial cause of everything else. Because that's what they're made out of. So this is only known to be true because the effects are not known as different substances. So this is only true. He reads as, this is only known to be true through authoritative means of proof. The authoritative means of proof is you look at the clay and then you know what all clay things are made out of. You don't know what iron things are made out of. So what this verse is saying is that the substance of the world is that everything is Brahman. But you don't know about quantitative differences. You know about qualitative oneness. You don't know about quantitative differences. Or the varieties of Brahman. I once asked Prabhupada this question, Well, we were on a morning walk. I was in New Vrindavan. And Prabhupada was talking about how everything is actually Brahman in different forms. And he gave the example that a tree is another form of fire. That this energy of the sun is transformed into this wood. But that wood is just another form of the sun's energy, because when you ignite it, again the fire comes out. So he says everything is spiritual. That's what he was saying, how everything is spiritual. There really isn't any matter, that everything is spiritual. He was making this point. So I got confused, because I was really trying hard to understand how I'm not this body, and the difference between matter and spirit. Then Prabhupada turns around and says, everything is spirit. I said, wait a minute, So I asked him that question. I said, we're trying to understand the difference between matter and spirit. That spirit is conscious and matter is non-conscious, that I am a spirit soul and that I'm not this body which is made of matter. So on the one hand, we have to understand the difference between spirit and matter. But now you're saying that everything is spirit. So Prabhupada said, there are different kinds of spirit. We are not Mayavadis. That's what he said. So that what we call matter, or the inferior energy, is another form of spirit. So what the Upanishads here, and what the Mayavadis do, they concentrate on the oneness. They abstract. Abstract means to take something like if I have a blue shirt, a blue truck, and a blue flower. If I just deal with blueness, you see, I've abstracted from the truck, from the shirt, from the flower, this one quality, blue. That's what you mean by abstract, to take out of. And so I just deal with blueness, this abstract feature. Or you take the example of science. Here you got this material world, all kinds of things happening. Science abstracts with respect to quantity. It only deals with things insofar as they can be quantified. You can represent them in terms of numbers. That's the basic abstraction scientists make. We're going to only deal with things insofar as they can be dealt with in terms of numbers. They deal with colors because they found a way of representing them in terms of number. This wavelength, that wavelength, this wavelength, Otherwise, colors don't exist. The sensation I have of redness, which has nothing to do with a wavelength of a certain number, is not dealt with by science. It's a feeling. It's a certain kind of feeling tone, which they can't deal with. So anyway, this was science. See, so science goes and it abstracts from nature and just deals with things so far as they are quantifiable. Then they take another step, which is just an act of pride, and says, if it's not quantifiable, it doesn't exist. So they read in their methodological limits into reality, because otherwise they won't have a hold of everything. So anyway, that's the human tendency. So the Mayavadis are interested in discovering their identity with Brahman. So they're not interested in difference, because the aim is just becoming liberated and understanding I am Brahman. The differences are ignored, and so they abstract with reference to this similarity. Because if you say you have a clay pot, clay jug, clay plate, when you say clay, you're abstracting also, insofar as they're clay. The other things you ignore.
So the point here is actually a hint of the Vishishta
Yeah, sure.
vision of Ramanuja.
Yeah, that's right.
Because the first part of this explanation deals with the variety, and the second part deals with the unity of the matter.
Right. And why would the man giving the example to his son say, look, you can understand how it's all one, because you understand that we have clay pots, clay plates, clay jugs, but really we can do everything we do with those with just a lump of clay. He can't be describing the unreality of all effects. That's not what goes on. It's very important whether the clay, if the clay is not shaped like this, it's not all one. This is where, the story is there about Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu eating clay. Right? Or eating dirt and saying, well, it's the same stuff, right? Well, this is where it comes from. Let me just say a few words. We're running really a whole day behind. I wanted to say a few words about Buddha and just tell a little historical picture. Buddha appeared about somewhere between 600 and 400 BC. Nobody knows exactly when he appeared. And
Which Buddha is this?
the one who appeared between 600 and 400 BC, that Buddha.
There's the Prince Buddha and the incarnation of Krishna Buddha.
This is the Prince Buddha. I don't know who the incarnation is. I always thought they were the same one. But I've heard somebody say that's not true, that the historical Buddha that all the Buddhists deal with is not the one who's the incarnation of Krishna. I never heard Prabhupada say that. He always treated this one as the one who was the incarnation.
Funny how they were born in the same city.
Huh?
Funny how they were born in the same
Anyway, so if there's a difference, I'm just talking about the Buddha of Buddhism. Prince Siddhartha Sakyamuni, the sage of the Sakya clan, Gautama Buddha in Bihar. From Bihar. Bihar Buddha. That one. The one Shankaracharya deals with, all these people, that Buddha. So, Buddhism gets very, very, very complicated and divides up into, even by Buddhist standards, an incredible variety of sects and subsects and sub-subsects with different doctrines and philosophies and so on, like that. And we'll get into a little bit of that when we discuss this day after tomorrow. But what Prabhupada tells us is a certain historical story that I want you to keep in mind. And that is, a progression toward Vedic restoration. Because what we know from Prabhupada about Buddha is that he came actually with the purpose of stopping animal slaughter. That, as you know, animal killing is sanctioned in the Vedas, but on a restricted basis. In the Karma Kanda section of the Vedas, it's allowed that if you do certain things, you can kill and eat an animal. You can offer a goat to Goddess Kali at midnight on the dark night of the month. You have to chant a mantra in his ear, saying, I'm killing you, in the next life you'll kill me. So sometimes you see governments do this, something they really don't want to go on, but they know they can't stop. They'll permit it so they can put all kinds of restrictions on it. Just like they license the selling of alcohol, but you have to be at least 21 and so on like that. So the same way the Vedas allow for meat eating. But as you can understand now from reading Shankaracharya, a clever priest can do practically anything in Scripture. And somehow or other, this license for restricted meat eating in the Vedas became completely taken to an extreme. And animal slaughter was going on in huge proportions. Of course, much of it was sacrificial performances. And in Vedic sacrifices, even when they, like for example, even today when their Vedic sacrifices perform, there are some communities which are still performing them in the old karma kanda, rigorous Vedic sacrifices. All the local Hindus protest because, herds of goats come in to be slaughtered. I mean, the amount of killing that goes on as these things that are done is pretty heavy. Yeah, there's a few communities that still do this. They're dying out fast. But mostly, the rigorous, Vedic sacrifices are not done anymore. Yeah.
As you're even back to the notes of Bhagavad and in his childhood he attended these different Kali pujas where they would slaughter all kinds of animals.
Yeah, well that's Kali Puja, that's one thing. But even Vedic sacrifices, which is not exactly Kali Puja, which is just a yajna, hundreds of animals were slaughtered. You can read in Srimad Bhagavatam, Narada Muni talking to King Prachinibarhishat. There's a description of how many animals he was slaughtering, in this, while performing sacrifices. So somehow or other it really got out of hand. And whatever restrictions were there, people found ways to get around and ignore them. And meat eating was flourishing like crazy, all under the plea of Vedic sacrifice. The scriptures say it's okay. So, Lord Buddha's purpose was to stop this sacrifice. So he preached ahimsa, non-violence, non-injury to other living entities. And he denied the authority of the Vedas. Because everything was being based on Vedic principles and on following the Brahmins who were sacrificing this. So he himself didn't come from a Brahminical background. He was a prince, he was a Kshatriya family. So you can see there may have been an anti-Brahminical social protest behind this thing. And so he did not accept the authority of the Vedas and preached this non-violence. So that if some few hundred years later, when finally Buddhism was taken up by the Emperor Ashoka, who was disgusted at what he had to do to win a kingdom by the loss of life it had caused, Buddhism spread all over India very, very quickly. If you really want to spread a religious movement or an ideology, you need the backing of the government. And you notice that Buddhism, Islam, Christianity, all these things spread when they had the government behind them. Christianity was nothing until Emperor Constantine became converted. Buddhism was nothing until Emperor Ashoka. Muhammad himself took over the city of Medina and led his troops out. So this is the fact of life. So what happened is that when Buddhism became victorious, Vedic sacrifices came to an end, animal slaughter came to an end, the emergency had been fulfilled, but then, people had become atheistic. There are no Vedas, there are no Brahmins. So there's the next step in the Vedic restoration is Sripad Shankaracharya. Right. So what he has to do is with people who are already very, very much influenced by Buddhist philosophy and Buddhist thinking, is he presents this Mayavad philosophy, which is described in the Padma Purana, Prachanam Bodham. It's covered Buddhism, crypto Buddhism. Crypto means secret. It's secret Buddhism. So that peoples whose minds were already inclined or absorbed in these Buddhistic ideas could then accept Shankaracharya and therefore accept the Vedas, the Brahmanas. You have to remember that Shankaracharya simply just didn't write his bhashyas. He also re-established the Brahminical community. The whole Smarta Brahmana system was set up by Shankaracharya. He restored the Brahmins and gave them, this is the way you should live. This is what you should worship. This is how you should do. He put them back. This is your philosophy, and this is what you should do. So he actually restored the Brahmins and the Vedas. So to do this, he interpreted the Vedas in such a way as to be very, very close to Buddhism. Because you say that in Buddhism, the ultimate goal is nirvana. And nirvana is described as emptiness, or as shunyata, as void. Right. We'll get into that later, exactly what that means. So then comes Shankaracharya, says, no, not nirvana. The absolute is not nirvana, is not shunyata. It's Brahman. But Brahman that has no name, form, qualities, relationships, or activities. So here's something here's nirvana, which is nothing, described as void. And here you say, no, here's Brahman, but no name, form, qualities. What's the difference? See, cognitively, they're identical. You can say Brahman, but once you get rid of name, form, qualities, relationships, and activities, what's left? Just a sort of abstract Brahmanness. At least as far as your mind goes, there's no difference. So if you're already got this idea of shunyavada, voidness, then this nirvishesha Brahman is just a little step away. You can go very easily from one to the next. So he made it easy for them to make the transition. They could believe in this. So they accepted this. But then, even though the transition was easy, then they believed in an Atma. Because the Buddhist philosophy, one of their main doctrines is anatma, no soul. No soul. But at least they accepted, if you come to Vedic philosophy, there's an Atma, there's Brahman, of course, ultimately they're one, etc. But, and you accept the authority of the Vedas now, that's back to being restored. That's the main thing. The Vedas are back, the Brahminical community is reestablished. So then you made some progress. So of course, then the next step is the rise of the Vaishnava Acharyas like Ramanuja, Madhvacharya, Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu to defeat this Mayavad philosophy and then bring back a complete restoration of the original meaning of the Vedas. So here you have this Vedic restoration that's spanning, 2,500 years of history. From Buddha to Shankaracharya to Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu.
How did Shankaracharya drive the Buddhist out of India?
Well, you don't read about it in mundane historical accounts. I haven't found any. But he's credited with driving them out of India by, the stories I've heard is he would challenge and defeat them in debate, and then they would decamp. So that must have gone on. But also, if he was just successful in reestablishing the Brahminical community and the prestige of the Vedas, then gradually people would go back to that, and the Buddhas would get left behind. I suspect they were having their own internal problems too, the Buddhists. But after that, you don't see now that you see very many Buddhists in India. They're not there. They're in Ceylon, Sri Lanka, and of course China, Japan. One thing interesting, it's almost time to go. One historian says that, it's very interesting, he says that Buddha spreads in countries where snakes are worshipped or dragons are regarded as nagas. Like a naga in China is a dragon. So they're very auspicious in China. And they worship them. So in the countries where Nagas are regarded as auspicious and wonderful and worshipable, Buddhism spreads very easily. But in other countries where the Nagas are viewed as bad, like Christian countries, St. George and the Dragon, they're all killing the dragons all the time, right? Buddhism doesn't catch hold. Because the Mahayana story is that there were some certain doctrines taught by Buddha at the very beginning, but which weren't released. And they were kept with the Nagas for some time. And then later, when people were ready, they were promulgated. So the Nagas have some special, place in the Buddhist scheme of things, like that. I thought that was an interesting observation. This kind of, yeah.
This explanation of Vedic restoration struck me always for the explanation we give for the appearance of Lord Buddha, since in our time there are more meat-eaters, so the answer of the advent of Lord Chaitanya, it doesn't seem like the externals of the appearance of the different acharyas are as important as the internal desire of the Lord to establish Vedic culture, because now there's also a great need of ahimsa, but the answer of the Lord is Sankirtan. He may as well have advanced immediately at the time of the abuse of the Vedas as Lord Buddha and spread Sankirtan.
Yeah, well, I don't know how to restore the Vedas. I figure Krishna knows what he's doing. He has his plan.